Welcome, everyone, to Lunch with the Idaho Way. I'm Scott McIntosh, opinion editor for the Idaho Statesman.
And I'm Brian Clark, opinion writer.
This week, we are talking about property taxes and local budgets.
Yeah, there's two bills involved here. One is House Bill 292, which would divert state funds towards paying down school bonds and levies. And it would do that using an average daily attendance formula. It aims to kind of give a big hit of revenue up front, but then also ongoing revenue into the future. Another bill that's out there is House Bill 273, which would allow a city's property tax base budget to be subject to a citizens' initiative or referendum, and that has passed the House by 36 to 33 margin and is now before Senate State Affairs.
And just a reminder to our viewers that you can ask questions by writing them in the comments section below on YouTube or Facebook, and we'll do our best to answer the questions during the show. To help us explain the issues, I spoke with Kelley Packer. She is a former state legislator and is now the executive director of the Association of Idaho Cities. She's also a former city council member, which I didn't realize. So she is very well versed in these issues. We talked at length about House Bill 292, and here's what she had to say about her support and her organization's support for the bill.
We have, as an association, the Association of Idaho Cities, have voted to support it for one reason, because it will actually, for the first time in many years, provide some property tax relief.
The bill intends to provide ongoing funding using that average daily attendance formula, as I mentioned earlier. One issue here is that these tend not to age that well. This was the old problem with the sales tax distribution formula from the state, and that wound up penalizing fast-growing cities and rewarding ones that were drying up. Is that an issue that you and Packer discussed?
Yeah, we did. We talked about that, and she said that penciling out the numbers, they start to not pencil out after a few years, and actually turns some cities and counties upside down on the funding. Regardless, she said her organization supports it just because it provides that property tax relief immediately, and it will. And we'll talk more about the details about how much how much relief it'll have. But she said that, for the first time in a long time, it actually provides immediate property tax relief. So they support it. But we did end up talking about kind of the underlying issue is local budgets, because, as you know, has been said many times, the state does not levy property taxes. Property taxes go to your city, your county, your school district, the mosquito abatement district, the emergency medical services. And so we talked a lot about local budgets, and she had some interesting things to say about, I asked her about this pervasive attitude, and Brian, you've seen this as well over the years covering the legislature, this pervasive attitude among many legislators that the cities are like children and they need to be kept in check and watched over by the adults in the legislature. So here's what she had to say about that issue.
Right, and it speaks to this long-running attitude, this philosophy that the locals are like children and they need to be kept in check. And you've heard House Speaker Mike Moyle, talk about we just got to rein in the locals, and the locals are just spending like crazy. And speak to that attitude of that attitude versus the idea of local control.
It's sincerely disheartening and frustrating. I don't know what local person did what to Mike, Speaker Moyle, back in the day, ran over his dog or what. I'm not sure what happened, but something had to him, because he really doesn't like him. And he says it's because there's duplicative services between counties and cities, and there really isn't. Most cities, there's only 60 cities that have their own police department. The rest contract with the county because it makes sense because of their size. The other cities had to provide additional law enforcement because the county couldn't do it. And so to think that if all 60 of those police departments went away, that the county wouldn't have to increase the number of police officers, etc., and that you would get some huge tax relief is unrealistic, unreasonable. So it's really disheartening to me, especially having served in that body, to watch what's happening, because they don't like it when the federal government does it to them. Why in the world would they do it to the locals who are actually doing this work in the face of the people that voted for them? They're not out in Boise, clear away from their district, or in Washington, D.C., clear away from their hometowns. They see them every day in the grocery store. They see them every day at church or school activities or at local events. They're constantly, I know because I was a council member before I was a legislator. You don't get away from it, right?
Right.
We got a couple of good questions from our viewers. Is there a legitimate reason legislators won't or can't prioritize fixing property taxes? You know, I don't know if you agree with me on this, Brian, but I think, you know, we're talking about residential property taxes. And what was happening was that commercial and agriculture interests kind of got the legislators to cap the homeowners exemption. And then when that got capped, residential property values kept on rising. And so there was a gap. And so it was capped at $100,000, but residential property values were going up. And if they were to increase the homeowners exemption, you would see a shift in the tax burden to commercial and agriculture properties. And I think that, for me, I think that's probably the main reason that legislators are loath to solve the problem.
Yeah, it's always seemed like they're picking winners and losers, and they've decided that business and ag are the winners and homeowners are the losers. An interesting dynamic here is that every year they continue to kick the can down the road on fixing that homeowners exemption, the harder it gets to fix, because there's been this tax burden shift that's been ongoing from business and ag onto homeowners, and it's been going on for years now. Every year that happens, it makes it harder to reverse the issue, because you'd have a massive spike to business and ag taxes if you tried to do it all at once. And so maybe you try and phase it in. But if the gap's been growing for 10 years, for 15 years, it gets really hard to see how you could ever overcome it.
Right. And so, when the homeowners exemption was capped in 2016, that cap was about $100,000, and which probably makes sense. That was probably around 50% of home value, average home value of $200,000, $250,000. But then, as we know now, median home values have gone up and are something like $500,000 in Ada County, $400,000, $450,000 in Canyon County. Other counties are seeing similar increases, but that cap was kept at $100,000. They did raise it to $125,000. If they had not capped it in 2016, that homeowners exemption would now be worth $224,000. So that's what it should be at today to keep those values in balance. Another question: what steps are in place to keep property taxes from going up? So that's the local budget that we've been talking about. And I spoke with Kelley Packer pretty in depth about the local budget process, which is a series of meetings every week or every other week. And the public is invited to come and weigh in and listen to the presentations. And then at the end of that process, this is each department. The police department gives their presentation, the Parks and Rec gives their presentation, the fire department gives their presentation, all these presentations. And then at the end of the process, they come up with a final budget and have another public hearing for people to come in and weigh in. And if the residents don't like it, or if they say, well, no, we don't need 5 police cars this year, we only need 2 to bring those property taxes down, they can do that at a public hearing. The problem is, because residential property values are going up so much, even if cities like Boise, if the city of Boise had kept their property tax budget flat, zero, no increase, just keep it the same. If it was $100 million last year, keep it $100 million this year, residential property taxes would still go up because that homeowner's exemption is capped. And so there was a bill by Representative Bruce Skog to raise the homeowner's exemption. Very simple, raise it to $224,000, which it would be if it had not been capped, up from the current $125,000. But that bill, I don't think, even got a hearing in the House Revenue and Taxation Committee.
No, that's true. It's House Bill 78 is the bill that would fix the homeowners exemption issue, and that's been sitting in committee without a hearing since early February 2nd or 3rd, I believe.
Yeah. And another question, rather than focus exclusively on property tax reform, shouldn't the legislature be analyzing the entire revenue generation stream? I guess I've written this before, that I think the system actually works. I think the system actually works pretty well. I think if they had not capped the homeowners exemption, I think property taxes would be equitable, and we wouldn't have an issue right now. I do think that there's something about, and Kelley Packer brought this up, about increasing the amount of sales tax revenue and online sales tax revenue to the cities and counties. And I don't know what you think about that possible solution, Brian.
Yeah, that would be interesting, especially since there was recently an overhaul of the formula used to distribute sales tax to cities. That was 3-4 years ago, I believe. Sort of the charge was led by the city of Annan on that. So that's at least reasonably up to date. The big problem with these distribution formulas is they never age well. So the old formula, how much revenue your city got had something to do with how many, I think it was how many cows in the county in the mid 80s. Like that had a factor in how much money your city got today. As far as other revenues to the city that the questioner asks, you've got fees, but those are subject to their own set of hearings during the budget setting. So I've not heard widespread complaints about fees. And then the other major sets of revenue have to do with sort of autonomous city services. Like some cities run airports, some cities, Idaho Falls runs a power company, things like that are almost run as municipally owned businesses, but they have their own separate revenue streams and expenditures. So it's possible the legislature could do something to analyze them, but it's unclear to me what the utility of that would be. And it wouldn't necessarily be a good idea to take that into account when you were doing things like this tax distribution. Like Idaho Falls looks like a much bigger city than it is because it runs a large power company and a regional airport. Right. So it looks like a much bigger city than it is if you were to include non-property tax revenue sources.
Right. And Nampa is the same way. When you compare Nampa and Meridian, people do this all the time. So, well, Meridian's tax levy rate is so much lower than Nampa's. Well, that's because Nampa has its own fire department. Meridian has its own police department as well. But Nampa runs a library, a civic center, 2 golf courses, the Fort Idaho Center. There's all sorts of things. And I will point out, too, that a lot of studies show that overall Idaho's tax structure is pretty efficient. We've got a little bit of income tax revenue. We've got a little bit of corporate tax revenue. We've got a little bit of sales tax revenue. We've got a little bit of property tax revenue. That it has a pretty good balance overall, and we rate pretty highly in terms of fairness when you talk about regressive taxes. We're certainly not the most progressive state, but when you balance out all of the various formulas, so I don't think we need a major overhaul or a big change. I think there's just some little tweaks. I think tweaking the residential property tax burden, The sales tax on groceries, I think, needs to be addressed, but little tweaks here and there to address the viewer's question about analyzing the entire revenue generation system. I think that overall, Idaho's is a pretty fair and balanced system. Wouldn't you say?
Yeah, there's probably some changes I would make, but it's fairly diverse, which has a lot of advantages to it, and it's also should be pointed out that the overall tax burden is quite low. Sometimes there will be a focus exclusively on income taxes, where Oregon doesn't have an income tax, so Idaho obviously ranks very poorly in comparison to Oregon in terms of income tax. But in terms of the overall tax burden, Idaho is one of the lower states. There's a regular report that comes out about this. I don't remember our exact ranking, but it's not bad.
Right. And again, I think that a lot of people bring up Prop 13 from California, and we should do that here. I think that would be a terrible idea. I did write a column about this a couple of years ago, and I'll maybe share that in the comments at some point. But I think overall our property tax system is a pretty good system because it treats like property alike. It treats a residential property the same as another residential property in terms of taxation. So I think, like I said, I think there's just some tweaks that need to be made around the edges. And one of those that Kelley Packer talked about, she talked about the number of properties that are exempted from paying property taxes. So this might be another little tweak. And here's what she had to say about the exempted properties.
Budgets, valuations, but also then exemptions. And I'm not saying that there aren't appropriate exemptions, but there's literally thousands of them. And we've never relooked at them to say, okay, does that one still make sense or no? If it does, does it still make sense at this level? Or should that be changed, adjusted, up, down, whatever? We're just ignoring them. In fact, we're introducing a couple new ones this year, potentially. And I'm like, that's so counterintuitive. You say you want homeowner property tax relief because that's who's calling you, but you're going to give some more businesses, for-profit businesses that are doing really well if you want to look at their, portfolio.
So there are a number of these exemptions. One of the biggest and sort of the elephant in the room that's not discussed as often is the agricultural tax exemption. Not exactly an exemption, but it has to do with the way that agricultural property is valued, which is basically based on the amount of crops or livestock it can support. And not on the potential sale value of the property, which is how business and home properties are valued. There's some policy reasons for this. If you especially like at the urban fringe, if you valued farms there according to what they would sell for, the property tax burden would be so high they'd all sell instantly, basically. Right. And you can argue about whether that's good or bad. But it's also clear that the biggest property tax giveaway is to the agricultural sector. They pay a fraction, a tenth of the property taxes they would probably pay otherwise. And it's hard to ignore the fact that farmers are heavily overrepresented in the ranks of the legislature. An awful lot of lawmakers are farmers.
Yeah, I'll give the counterpoint though, and again, because we use property taxes to fund local services. So ambulance services, police and fire and libraries. And, you could make the argument, and I'm sure many have, that farmland does not absorb those services, do not use those services, clearly not nearly as much as a house or a business. So I can get that argument, and I'm maybe not as cynical to think that we have that law just because we have a bunch of farmers in the legislature, but I think there's probably good reason for that. That, why would you tax, a farm field a bunch of money to fund a new school building when that farm field clearly is not contributing to new students? So I guess that's one argument. Now, whether that's too low or too high, that can be debatable. But I again, I go back to, I think the system works pretty well. But one of those tweaks, and maybe we can go back to House Bill 292, is funding of school buildings. So a big chunk of this 292 is to create a fund of about $100 million to distribute to school districts to pay for school buildings and school maintenance, which sounds great. And for sure, it would reduce property taxes at the local level, because those school bonds are a big chunk of people's property tax bills. As much as a quarter or a third of somebody's tax bill, depending on how many new buildings you've got in your school district. It's a big chunk of your property tax bill. And so $100 million would help, but really it's kind of a drop in the bucket. If you look at Nampa School District just this month asked its voters for $210 million, just really for maintenance, to build a couple of new schools that are deteriorating and replace those schools. CUNA School District, I think, asked for over 100 million, 110 million or 120 million, something like that. And both of those bonds failed. So to think about $100 million from the state coffers to be distributed among 144 school districts across the state, it's really kind of inadequate and really won't do much once you spread it out. And there was an Office of Performance Evaluation study that just came out last year that showed that there's a $850 million shortfall in school building maintenance projects every year. 850 million. So $100 million really is not going to go that far to relieve property tax bills in a really serious way. All right.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts, Brian? I don't see.
No, I think that pretty much has it for me.
All right. It sounds like probably House Bill 292 is probably going to pass. It's got enough support, and I would imagine the governor will sign it. I don't think it'll lead to tremendous property tax relief, but it'll probably be some. And then 7 or 8 years from now, we'll be like, oh, geez, that formula is not working anymore. What happened? Why did we do that? Why didn't we just solve the problem by raising the homeowners exemption? And so I think that's the conversation that we'll have 7, 8 years from now. So, all right. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us again this week. We'll be back next week at the same time with another episode. And if you could do me a favor, tell us in the comments what topics you'd like us to tackle in future episodes. We're open to anything, and we're open to your suggestions, what you want to see. In the meantime, please sign up for my free weekly email newsletter, The Idaho Way. The link is below in the comments. And I want to thank Kelley Packer from the Association of Idaho Cities for helping us delve into the issue of property taxes and local budgets this week. So thank you again all for joining us, and we'll see you next week.